what is a gender? If, like me, your understanding of gender started in mainstream Western education, you're probably inclined to tie the term gender to sex. It's something we're all taught from a young age. Our bodies present in one way, and that this body's sex is also our gender. It's not something we're really encouraged to question. So in 2017, the World Health Organization defined sex as the biological and physiological characteristics that define men and women. They also defined gender as the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society deems appropriate for men and women. Now, if you've been following the coverage of trans issues at all in the media in recent years, you probably have noticed a boom in that coverage since about 2014, the so-called transgender tipping point. Now, this phrase, originally coined by Time magazine, has been used to describe an increase in the visibility of trans individuals in the media, but also increased exposure of the trans rights movement. So if you've had this coverage in your periphery at all, you'll also be aware of the fact that the gender and sex discussion has become a point of contention. Even insinuating that gender and sex are not synonymous terms, terms of equivalent meaning, has become highly controversial. So today, I'm here to dispel a few myths surrounding gender identity and ask instead not what is a gender, but instead what's in a gender. So we often depend on particular building blocks to explain how gender is established. And the primary building blocks are psychology, biology, and culture. And when I say culture, I mean one's geographical and temporal location, one's space and time. Now, early explanations of gender lent entirely on one discipline or another. We looked exclusively to human anatomy for answers, or we believed gender to be entirely contingent on social constructs. So as we unpack the box of gender identity, I want us to bring out our most misunderstood building block, biology. So, sex and gender are often considered to be synonymous in part because we believe both to be a binary. We believe that only male and female states of mind can exist because only male and female bodies exist, aside from what we consider to be rare and unusual occurrences. However, biology never was that simple, and our perceptions of physical sexes are shaped not only by misinformation and a lack of comprehensive education on the subject, but also by medical malpractice. I'm talking about the prevalence rate of intersex individuals. So intersex individuals are those born with a chromosomal, gonadal, hormonal, or genital variation, which is estimated to occur in 1.7% of the global population. That's over 1 in 100 of us, and it's the same incidence rate as redheads. So if you have ever met a ginger person before, you have probably just as likely also met an intersex person. So sometimes these variations are visible at birth, and the context that I'll give you here is that at this time there are only 5 countries in the world that grant intersex individuals the basic human right of bodily autonomy. And for reference, those countries are Albania, Malta, Portugal, India, and Uruguay. So for those whose variations are visible in most countries, they are subjected to traumatic and unnecessary medical interventions before the age of medical consent. Now, these variations aren't always visible at birth. And what that means is that statistically, of the 1 in 100 people in the room today, 1 in 100 of us were assigned a gender at birth, which actually has absolutely nothing to do with our sex. We were merely prescribed a social role and expected to behave in particular ways based on how conventionally male or female our genitals looked at birth. And I will add, as a final point, that the criteria for clitoromegaly, which is how large is too large for an otherwise functional and healthy clitoris in anyone, intersex or not, was formulated by cisgender male doctors. And the point that I'm trying to make with that is that bodies have been medically and ultimately aesthetically regulated for decades based on the ideals and values of people who do not share the same anatomy. No science is without bias, and medicine has long had a bias against individuals who naturally defy gender and sex stereotypes. So, if anatomy at birth defies two discrete categories, what about other facets of biology? I want to talk to you next about hormones. So we often assume that with hormones, estrogen is the female hormone, and androgens are male hormones, and the most famous of all the androgens is, of course, testosterone. But the separation of the two isn't actually that clear-cut, and all individuals have varying levels of androgens and estrogen in their bodies. So what you can see on this graph is the salivary testosterone levels of male and female sex individuals from a paper by Stanton. So what you can see here is that although we have two distinct peaks, there is an overlap between the two, and male levels vary quite broadly across that graph. So what do we make of this data? In her outstanding book, Testosterone Rex, Dr. Cordelia Fine writes that given the variability in the number of androgen receptors in the body, their location and their sensitivity, blood and salivary measures of testosterone are at best an incredibly crude measure of testosterone's effects on the brain. It's important to remember that hormones are a material, and what the body does with that material varies hugely from one individual to another. In fact, early research into the effects of testosterone by Masters et al. Found that for males developing in utero who are exposed to higher levels of testosterone, they may develop brains which are desensitized to the effects of testosterone later in life. People of particular sexes, we'd expect, would always produce certain levels of these hormones, right? We want to imagine the body and the brain as isolated systems, impervious to change via external stimuli. So this is where biology crosses into psychology. If it's difficult to gender the body based on sex, then what about the mind? So emerging research paints a complex picture of the impact of external environments on the biology and psychology of gender and sex. In a study by Van Anders, Steiger, and Goldie, the researchers trained actors to perform a workplace monologue where they fired an employee, a monologue which they considered gendered based on their perception of this behavior as inherently masculine. What the researchers then did was measure the testosterone levels of the actors before and after performing the monologue, and what they found was astounding. In males, the testosterone levels did not change, but in females, these levels increased significantly and stayed there for some time. The implication of this, researchers theorized, is that gendered behavior modulates testosterone, or to put it simply, our ideas about gender can change the anatomy of our bodies. The internalization of our ideas about masculinity and femininity can have an impact on our bodies, just like how the chemicals of our mind regarding mental health are impacted by our external environment. Because it's not such a radical notion when we're talking about something like serotonin. So why is it so surprising when we're talking about something like estrogen or androgens? So this is where biology and psychology become contingent on the social factors that shape our ideas of gender. And those social factors are all around us, and they're often contingent on the time frame in which we live as well, the period that we're living in. Now, I can't go into this hugely today, unfortunately, but as an interesting anecdote, laws in the UK today stipulate the conduct of males and females. But actually, back in the 17th century, jurist Sir Edward Coke was writing intersex individuals into succession law. So this is one of many examples that we have that our ideas about gender and sex binaries today have not existed throughout the entirety of British history. But if they had, would that give British culture the authority to determine what sex and gender means? Why does one culture get to decide the blueprint for sex and gender? It's important that we also consider gender from a geographical perspective. So we could call this a global approach, but in actuality, what I'm going to ask you to do today is consider the following examples from a decolonial lens, considering how gender varies all around the world, particularly in countries where their histories have been overlooked and whitewashed through the colonization of their countries. So what does gender look like outside of a predominantly white Eurocentric bubble? I want to take you first to Indonesia, the home of the Bugis people. Now, Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch and, as is the process of colonization, had many social values imposed upon them. And the Bugis community has been impacted not only by colonization, but also by globalization, by the importing of Western media that has rigid ideals and beliefs about what sex and gender look like. Now, this is pertinent because the Bugis community have traditionally recognized a 5-gender, 3-sex social system. So to go over that quickly, Urane is comparable to being a cisgender man, so being assigned male at birth and identifying as male. Makunrai is like a cisgender woman. Chalalai is kind of like a transgender man, but not the same. And Chalabai is similar to, but not the same as, being a trans woman. Now, the 5th gender, Bisu, is often misunderstood. But having had it explained to me by a Bugis Indonesian citizen during my time in Jakarta, it's best to imagine this gender as a meta-gender. They believe that to be Bisu means that you transcend ideas of masculinity, femininity, and other gender descriptors entirely. And it is considered essential for Bugis culture that all 5 of these identities coexist harmoniously. So, if you're imagining some wee village in a corner of Indonesia, now is the time to apply your decolonial lens. This isn't a small community. We're talking about 6 million Indonesian citizens. I want to take you next to the United States of America, one of the greatest sites of colonial abuse. So you may have heard of the term two-spirit. The term itself is new, but was coined only to replace the pejorative term used by early anthropologists to refer to third-gender individuals who existed in some Native American communities. See, historically, in some of these communities, gender was not determined by physical sex or even one's role within a relationship, but actually by occupational skills and proficiencies. So, for example, one could be particularly adept at basket weaving, which was considered a feminine skill. So you could be good at basket weaving and be feminine but not two-spirit, or it could be an indicator of being a two-spirit person. And if you were two-spirit, you were afforded the same roles and opportunities and even burial rights as women or men or both within the community. Now, this history was lost. It was buried under colonialism. But now, in this day, many Native American individuals are reclaiming this history and reclaiming this term to describe their existence outside of that reductive male-female binary. I want to bring in one last example today of where gender and sex binaries are both highly reductive and inappropriate. In the village of Las Salinas in the Dominican Republic, individuals are born who, at birth, appear of female sex. And at puberty, where they appear to have vaginas and vulvas, their testes descend and penises grow. These individuals are referred to as huevadoches, which translates directly to penis at 12, or as makihembras, which means first a woman, then a man. And the incidence rate is 1 huevadoche to every 90 males in this community. It is caused by lower levels of the 5-alpha reductase enzyme when developing in the womb. Now, I will refrain from referring to these lower levels as a deficiency, since this is one of the many variations which makes up that 1 in 100 intersex statistic. So how can we begin to compare the life experiences of these individuals to non-intersex males, even if their anatomy looks highly similar, if not the same, by adulthood? How do we begin to compare their upbringings and early perceptions of themselves to non-intersex individuals? These rigid gender and sex binaries simply do not make space for how gender varies and sex varies all around the world. And at this time, we know of 26 terms, at least, for what we in the West would boil down to meaning transgender. And many of these terms existed long before our reductive understanding of cisgender and transgender ever did. I can only give you a small insight today into how gender and sex varies around the world, particularly in communities where they have had a gender binary unreasonably imposed upon them. So, is our modern Western conceptualization of gender wrong? Or simply contingent on factors of the world which are too subject to change and too complex? Because gender is too complex to boil down into discrete categories or even points on a sliding scale. We don't do this with any other facet of the human experience. Gender is as unique as the self. We have shared trends and experiences, but these are not the same as static categories. An intersectional perspective makes it clear that even just being a cisgender woman or cisgender man is inherently complex. It is contingent on race, it is contingent on socioeconomic status, sexuality, physical ability, country of origin. It is not the same to be a black woman as it is to be a white woman. It is not the same to be a disabled man as it is to be a non-disabled man. We do a disservice by trying to homogenize these groups into having singular, shared narratives. So what's the point? If we can't regulate gender, then how do we use it to enforce laws, determine healthcare access, tailor our education systems? The answer is, we don't. Gender is not a piece of information that we should use to control people or deny them resources or knowledge. We shouldn't be pushing for infinite gender descriptors to be included in legislation. We should be striving for laws which uphold equity beyond that reductive male-female binary. Healthcare should be accessible to all. And I'm thinking now about how in this country, transgender men are removed from the screening register for cervical smear tests for cervical cancer the moment that their documentation lists them as male. Our mainstream education systems also assume that not only will our children always be cisgender, but that none of them are intersex. And I will say it again, 1 in 100 of us are. 1 in 100 of us were denied the right to understand our bodies because we have not made space for those who naturally defy an obsolete binary. So to answer the question, what's in a gender? Everything. Everything is in a gender. The most finite and intricate details of you and the life you have led inform your gender. And the more we strive for a world that isn't reduced to binaries, the more egalitarian our communities become. We have nothing to lose but a system which never served our best interests anyways. There is space for all of us. Thank you very much.